The rescuers dismissed the stray cat, but when they saw the note on his collar. Eleanor Ainsworth lived a life as predictable as the sunrise over the Kansas plains. At 78, her days in the small town of Havenwood followed a rhythm set by decades of habit. Her small, clapboard house, painted a faded robin's egg blue, stood on the edge of town, a stone's throw from the wheat fields that stretched to the horizon like a golden ocean. Her mornings began with the first light. She'd rise, her joints creaking a protest that she habitually ignored, and put on the kettle. While the water heated, she'd step onto the small porch, breathe in the crisp morning air, and survey her domain. It wasn't much, just a small patch of lawn, a few rose bushes that stubbornly bloomed despite her neglect, and a weathered bird feeder that was perpetually besieged by squirrels. The only other occupant of the house, and the undisputed king of it, was Rusty. A ginger tomcat of indeterminate age and impressive girth. Rusty had adopted Eleanor 5 years prior, simply strolling in through an open window one afternoon and deciding to stay. He was a creature of comfort, spending his days alternating between napping in sunbeams, demanding food, and occasionally deigning to bestow his affection upon Eleanor with a rumbling purr and a headbutt to her leg. Eleanor's social life was limited. Her husband, George, had passed away 10 years earlier, and their only child, a daughter named Sarah, lived in California with a family of her own. Phone calls and the occasional holiday visit were the extent of their contact. Eleanor wasn't lonely, not exactly. She'd always been a solitary person, finding contentment in her own company and the simple routines of her life. She had a few acquaintances in town, ladies she'd see at the weekly bingo night at the community center, but no close friends. Her days were filled with small tasks, tending to her meager garden, baking bread, the smell of which often lured Rusty from his naps, reading well-worn books from the local library, and watching the news on her old television set. The news lately had been filled with reports of severe weather brewing in the region. Tornado season was upon them, and the forecasters were warning of a particularly dangerous system moving across the plains. Eleanor had lived through her share of tornadoes. Havenwood wasn't quite in the heart of Tornado Alley, but it was close enough. She remembered the big one of '87, which had ripped the roof off the hardware store and uprooted old Mr. Henderson's prized oak tree. She wasn't overly worried, but she took the usual precautions. She checked the batteries in her weather radio, a bulky, old-fashioned thing that George had insisted on buying. She made sure she had enough canned goods and bottled water in the pantry. And, most importantly, she located the small pet carrier that she used for Rusty's rare trips to the vet. She didn't like putting him in it, but if a tornado warning came, she wanted to be able to get him to the basement quickly. The basement was her designated storm shelter. It was small and damp, with concrete walls and a low ceiling. A single, bare bulb Pro VY dead the only light. Along one wall were shelves filled with dusty jars of preserves, remnants of a time when George was alive and they'd had a much larger garden. A heavy wooden door, reinforced with metal brackets, led to the outside world, providing a second exit in case the stairs were blocked. On this particular afternoon, the sky had taken on an ominous greenish hue. The wind, which had been a gentle breeze earlier, was now whipping through the trees, making the branches dance wildly. The air was heavy and still, charged with an almost palpable tension. Eleanor sat on her porch swing, Rusty curled up in a ball at her feet, and watched the storm gather. She stroked Rusty's soft fur, feeling the rumble of his purr beneath her fingertips. "Looks like we're in for a bit of a blow, old boy," she murmured. Rusty twitched an ear but didn't open his eyes. The weather radio crackled to life, interrupting the afternoon quiet with a burst of static. A robotic voice announced a tornado watch for the entire county. Eleanor sighed. This was becoming routine. She'd heard dozens of tornado watches over the years, and most of them amounted to nothing. Still, she knew better than to ignore them. She went inside, turning on the television to the local news channel. The weatherman, a young man with an overly enthusiastic demeanor, was pointing at a swirling mass of red and yellow on the radar map. "This is a dangerous storm, folks," He was saying, his voice pitched high with excitement. "We're seeing strong rotation, and we have multiple reports of tornadoes on the ground. If you're in Havenwood or the surrounding areas, you need to take shelter immediately." Just then, the tornado sirens began to wail. The sound, a long, mournful howl, sent a shiver down Eleanor's spine. This was it. This was no drill. She scooped Rusty up, ignoring his indignant meow, and stuffed him into the pet carrier. He yowled and clawed at the mesh, but she held the carrier firmly. I know, she said soothingly. "It's okay, Rusty. We'll be safe in the basement." She grabbed her purse, a small flashlight, and the weather radio, and hurried down the creaking wooden stairs to the basement. The air was cooler down there, and the smell of damp earth and old preserves filled her nostrils. She set the carrier down on the floor and closed the door behind her, securing the latch. The sirens continued to wail, their sound amplified by the enclosed space. Eleanor switched on the flashlight and sat down on a rickety wooden stool, her heart pounding in her chest. She took a deep breath, trying to calm her nerves. She'd been through this before. She'd survived. Rusty, finally resigned to his fate, had settled down in the carrier, his orange eyes gleaming in the dim light. Eleanor reached through the mesh and stroked his head. "We'll be all right, boy," she whispered. "We'll be all right." The house above them began to shake. The first sign of the tornado's imminent arrival wasn't a Sul one, but an auditory assault. The wailing sirens, which had been a constant, droning presence, were suddenly drowned out by a sound like a freight train bearing down on them. It was a low, guttural roar that brat through the very ground beneath Eleanor's feet. She clutched the weather radio to her chest, her knuckles white. The robotic voice, now barely audible above the din, was repeating the same message over and over. "Tornado warning. Havenwood. Take shelter immediately." The single light bulb in the basement flickered violently, casting grotesque, dancing shadows on the concrete walls. Eleanor squeezed her eyes shut, her body trembling. She'd heard stories about the sound a tornado made, but nothing could have prepared her for the sheer, terrifying reality of it. Rusty, sensing her fear, let out a low, mournful meow from inside the carrier. Eleanor reached down and stroked his fur through the mesh, trying to offer him some comfort, though she herself felt none. The roaring intensified, becoming a deafening crescendo. The house above them groaned and creaked, as if in agony. Eleanor could hear the shattering of glass, the splintering of wood, the tearing of metal. It sounded like the world was being ripped apart. She huddled on the stool, her arms wrapped around herself, and began to pray. She prayed for her safety, for Rusty's safety, for her daughter in California. She prayed for the storm to pass, for the destruction to end. Suddenly, there was a deafening crash directly above them. The basement ceiling, which had been holding firm, buckled and cracked. A large section of it, weakened by the force of the wind, gave way, sending a cascade of debris raining down into the basement. Eleanor screamed, shielding her head with her arms. Dust and dirt filled the air, choking her. She coughed and sputtered, trying to clear her lungs. When she dared to open her eyes, she saw a scene of utter devastation. A large portion of the ceiling had collapsed, leaving a gaping hole through which she could see the swirling, black sky. The shelves along one wall had been ripped from their moorings, sending jars of preserves smashing to the floor, their contents splattering across the concrete. The wooden door leading to the outside was gone, ripped clean off its hinges. And, most terrifyingly, the stairs leading up to the main floor of the house were completely blocked by a mountain of rubble. Wood, plaster, furniture, and twisted metal were piled high, forming an impenetrable barrier. Eleanor stared at the wreckage, her mind struggling to comprehend the scale of the destruction. She was trapped, completely and utterly trapped. The wind continued to howl, but the deafening roar had subsided somewhat, replaced by a steady driving rain. Water poured through the hole in the ceiling, soaking Eleanor to the bone. She shivered, both from the cold and from the fear that was now a cold knot in her stomach. She looked around the basement, her eyes desperately searching for some sign of hope, some way out. But there was nothing, just rubble and debris, and the growing darkness as the storm clouds blotted out the last of the daylight. Rusty, who had been miraculously spared from the falling debris, was huddled in the corner of his carrier, his eyes wide with terror. Eleanor crawled over to him, her knees scraping against the broken glass and splintered wood. "Rusty," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "Oh, Rusty, are you all right?" The cat let out a weak meow, pressing his head against the mesh of the carrier. Eleanor reached in and stroked his fur, finding some small comfort in the familiar feel of him. She tried to stand, but a sharp pain shot through her left leg. She looked down and saw a large gash on her calf, bleeding freely. She tore a strip of fabric from her skirt and tied it around the wound, wincing at the pain. She had to think. She had to find a way out. She couldn't just sit here and wait to die. She tried to move some of the debris blocking the stairs, but it was too heavy. The larger pieces of wood and furniture were wedged together tightly, forming an unyielding mass. She pushed and pulled, her hands raw and bleeding, but it was no use. She shone the flashlight around the basement, searching for any other possible exit. The wooden door was gone, but the opening it had left was too small, blocked by twisted metal and broken concrete. There was no way she could squeeze through it. Despair began to creep in, a cold, suffocating blanket. She was trapped, injured, and alone. The storm was still raging outside, and the water was rising steadily on the basement floor. She was running out of time. Her eyes landed on a small, higher section of the basement wall. There was a small, narrow crack that showed light. Eleanor pulled Rusty's cage to the crack. "I am sorry, boy," Eleanor said. "You are my only hope." Eleanor struggled to open the cage. Rusty seemed to understand and didn't resist, which made Eleanor very sad. She opened the basement ceiling, which was damaged by the tornado, but it still stuck. Eleanor tried her best to hit and push the ceiling, and finally made a hole that Rusty can get through. She took out a pen and a piece of paper from her purse with trembling hands. Her handwriting, usually so neat and precise, was shaky and uneven. "Help," she wrote. "Trapped in basement, 12 Elm Street, Eleanor Ainsworth." She folded the note carefully and attached it to Rusty's collar with a safety pin she found in her purse. It was a long shot, a desperate gamble, but it was the only chance she had. "Go, Rusty," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "Find someone. Please, find someone." She lifted the cat to the hole, her arms aching. Rusty hesitated for a moment, looking back at her with his big, golden eyes. Then, with a final meow, he squeezed through the opening and disappeared into the storm. The silence that descended after Rusty's departure was almost as terrifying as the roar of the tornado. The wind still howled, and the rain continued to lash against the remnants of the house, but the immediate, overwhelming cacophony had subsided. Eleanor was left alone with her thoughts, her fears, and the growing certainty that she might not survive. The flashlight beam, her only source of light, cut through the inky blackness of the basement, illuminating the chaos around her. The water level was rising steadily, now several inches deep and lapping at her ankles. She could feel the cold seeping into her bones, making her shiver uncontrollably. Her leg throbbed with a dull, persistent ache. The makeshift bandage she'd applied was already soaked through with blood. She knew she needed to get it properly treated, but that seemed like an impossible luxury at the moment. She tried to shift her position, to find a slightly drier spot, but every movement sent jags of pain through her injured leg. She settled for leaning against a relatively intact section of the wall, trying to keep as much of her body out of the water as possible. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth, mildew, and the sweet, cloying scent of the spilled preserves. The combination was nauseating, and Eleanor fought back the urge to vomit. Time seemed to stretch out, each minute an eternity. She tried to focus on something, anything other than her predicament. She thought of her daughter, Sarah, picturing her face, her smile. She imagined her grandchildren, whom she hadn't seen in over a year. She clung to these images, these memories, as if they were a lifeline. She tried to remember the words to her favorite hymns, humming them softly to herself. The familiar melodies brought a small measure of comfort, a momentary distraction from the fear that gnawed at her. But the reality of her situation kept intruding. She was trapped, alone, in a dark, flooded basement, with no way to call for help. The chances of Rusty finding someone, of anyone even noticing him in the midst of the storm's aftermath, seemed vanishingly small. She thought of George, her late husband. He had always been the strong one, the practical one. He would have known what to do. He would have found a way out. A wave of grief washed over her, so intense that it almost doubled her over. She missed him, missed his steady presence, his reassuring smile. As the hours dragged on, Eleanor's hope began to dwindle. She felt a growing sense of resignation, a weary acceptance of her fate. She was tired, so tired. The pain in her leg was constant, and the cold was seeping deeper and deeper into her bones. She closed her eyes, letting her head fall back against the wall. She imagined herself drifting off to sleep, escaping the pain and the fear. It would be so easy, so peaceful just to let go. But then, a flicker of defiance, a spark of her old stubbornness, rekindled within her. She wouldn't give up. Not yet. She owed it to George, to Sarah, to Rusty, to herself, to fight for every last breath. She opened her eyes, forcing herself to focus on the present moment. She needed to stay alert, to be ready if, by some miracle, help did arrive. She took slow, deep breaths, trying to conserve her energy. She began to talk to herself, whispering words of encouragement, reciting prayers, anything to keep her mind occupied. She recounted stories from her childhood, memories of happier times. She talked to Rusty, as if he were still there beside her, imagining his warm fur and his rumbling purr. The water continued to rise, now reaching her knees. She shifted her position again, trying to find a higher spot, but there was nowhere left to go. The cold was becoming unbearable, her teeth chattering uncontrollably. She knew hypothermia was setting in. Her thoughts were becoming muddled, her movements sluggish. She struggled to stay awake, to fight off the creeping drowsiness that threatened to engulf her. She saw Rusty, clearly, standing over her, looking concerned. "Rusty," she mumbled. "You came back." She tried to reach Rusty, but she can't move. Then, she found Rusty wasn't there, it just her imagination. A wave of disappointment washed over her, so strong, so powerful. She closed her eyes one last time. Then she saw George. He smiles at her just like before. "George, it's time to go, Ellie," George said. "I am not ready." "You did good, Ellie. I am proud of you." George held her hand. "It's warm." Eleanor smiled. Just as she was about to slip into unconsciousness, she heard a sound. A faint, scratching sound, coming from somewhere above her. She dismissed it at first, thinking it was just the wind or the settling of the debris. But then she heard it again, louder this time. A distinct scratching, followed by a muffled meow. Her heart leaped with a sudden surge of hope. Could it be? Could Rusty have actually found someone? She mustered all her remaining strength and shouted, her voice weak and raspy. "Help! I'm here! I'm in the basement!" She waited, listening intently. The scratching continued, and then she heard a voice, faint but definitely human. "Hello? Is anyone down there?" "Yes," Eleanor cried. "I'm here. I'm trapped." She heard the sound of digging, of debris being moved. The voice called out again, closer this time. "We hear you. We're coming. Just hold on." Tears streamed down Eleanor's face, tears of relief, of gratitude, of sheer, overwhelming joy. She wasn't going to die. She was going to be rescued. She clung to that thought, that hope, as the sounds of the rescue effort grew closer. She could hear the voices of several people now, working together to clear a path through the wreckage. After what seemed like an eternity, but was probably only a few minutes. A beam of light pierced the darkness. A face appeared in the opening above her. A young man with a kind, concerned expression. "We've got you," he said, his voice filled with relief. "We're going to get you out of here." The moment Rusty squeezed through the narrow opening in the basement wall, he was met with a scene of utter chaos. The world he knew, the familiar landscape of his quiet neighborhood, had been transformed into a twisted, unrecognizable wasteland. The wind was still howling, although not as fiercely as before, and rain lashed down, stinging his fur and blurring his VY shown. Debris was scattered everywhere. Broken tree limbs, shattered glass, twisted metal, and the remnants of houses that had been ripped apart by the tornado's fury. Rusty was disoriented and frightened. The familiar sense of his home, of Eleanor, were mixed with the acrid smell of dust, rain-soaked wood, and something else. Something metallic and unsettling that he couldn't quite place. His instincts told him to run, to find shelter, to hide from the storm. But the note attached to his collar, a small, rectangular piece of paper flapping in the wind, reminded him of his mission. He had to find help. He had to find someone to save Eleanor. He started moving, picking his way carefully through the debris. His paws slipped on wet surfaces, and he had to jump over fallen power lines, dodge sharp pieces of metal, and navigate around piles of rubble that blocked his path. The rain made it difficult to see, and the wind kept trying to knock him off his feet. He was soaked to the bone, his fur plastered to his body, making him shiver with cold. But he pressed on, driven by a primal urge to fulfill his purpose. He encountered other animals along the way. A stray dog, cowering under an overturned car. A family of squirrels, their nest destroyed, frantically searching for their young. A flock of birds, their wings battered, huddled together on a broken tree branch. Rusty ignored them, his focus solely on finding help for Eleanor. He tried to follow the familiar streets, but many of them were impassable, blocked by mountains of debris. He had to detour through backyards, across fields, and even through the wreckage of houses, his senses on high alert for any sign of danger. He came across several people, but they were too preoccupied with their own struggles to notice him. Some were injured, tending to their wounds. Others were frantically searching through the rubble of their homes, looking for loved ones or salvaging what they could. Still others were simply standing, dazed and shell-shocked, staring at the devastation around them. Rusty tried to get their attention. He meowed loudly, rubbed against their legs, even tried to tug at their clothing with his teeth. But they either ignored him or shooed him away, too caught up in their own problems to understand what he was trying to tell them. He began to feel discouraged. The task seemed impossible. How could he, a small cat, possibly find someone to help in this vast, chaotic landscape? He came to a main road, or what was left of it. A group of people were gathered there, some wearing uniforms, others in civilian clothes. They were using heavy equipment to clear the debris, their faces grim and determined. These must be the rescuers. Rusty somehow knew it. He approached them cautiously, his tail twitching nervously. He meowed loudly, trying to get their attention. But the noise of the machinery and the shouts of the workers drowned him out. He tried to weave his way through their legs, hoping they would notice him. But they were too focused on their work, stepping around him without even a glance. He saw one man, a tall, broad-shouldered figure in a bright yellow jacket, who seemed to be in charge. He was directing the others, his voice calm and authoritative. Rusty decided to focus on him. He ran towards the man, meowing as loudly as he could. He rubbed against his legs, purring furiously, trying to convey the urgency of his mission. The man barely glanced at him, stepping aside to avoid tripping over him. Rusty was persistent. He followed the man, weaving between his feet, getting in his way, making a nuisance of himself. He knew he was risking being kicked or stepped on, but he didn't care. He had to get this man's attention. The man finally stopped, looking down at Rusty with an annoyed expression. "Get out of the way, cat," he said gruffly. "We've got work to do." Rusty didn't budge. He looked up at the man, his golden eyes pleading, and let out a long, mournful meow. He nudged the man's leg with his head, then turned and started walking away, looking back as if to say, "Follow me." The man hesitated. He was about to shoo the cat away again, but something in Rusty's demeanor gave him pause. The cat seemed determined, purposeful. He wasn't just wandering aimlessly. He seemed to be trying to lead him somewhere. "What is it, boy?" the man said, his voice softening slightly. Rusty meowed again and started walking away again, more urgently this time. He kept looking back, making sure the man was following. The man, whose name was Captain Jake Thompson, had been a firefighter and rescue worker for over 20 years. He'd seen a lot of strange things, a lot of desperate situations. He'd learned to trust his instincts, and his instincts were telling him that this cat was trying to tell him something. But other people didn't think so. "Jake, what are you doing? We need move that tree. It's just a cat. Leave it alone, we have more important thing to do." Jake ignored his colleague's protests. "Hold on a minute," he said. "I'm just going to see what this cat wants." He had a nagging feeling, a hunch that he couldn't ignore. He'd learned over the years that sometimes the smallest clues, the most unlikely sources, could lead to the biggest breakthroughs. He followed Rusty, who was now trotting purposefully through the debris-strewn streets. The cat moved with a surprising agility, navigating the obstacles with ease. Jake had to be careful where he stepped, avoiding sharp objects and unstable piles of rubble. The rain had stopped, and the clouds were beginning to break, revealing patches of blue sky. The wind had died down to a gentle breeze. The air was still filled with the smell of dust and destruction, but there was also a faint scent of something else. Something familiar. Rusty led him towards the edge of town, to the area where the older houses were located. Jake recognized the street, Elm Street, although it looked nothing like he remembered it. Houses were reduced to piles of rubble, trees were uprooted, and the road was barely visible beneath the debris. He was having second thoughts now. This was probably a wild goose chase. The cat was probably just looking for food or shelter. He was about to turn back when Rusty stopped in front of a particularly large pile of wreckage. It was the remnants of a small, clapboard house, painted a faded robin's egg blue. The roof had collapsed, the walls had crumbled, and the entire structure was a tangled mess of wood, plaster, and broken furniture. Rusty sat down at the edge of the rubble, looking up at Jake with an expectant expression. He let out a loud, insistent meow, then started scratching at the debris with his paw. Jake's heart skipped a beat. He suddenly understood. This wasn't just any pile of wreckage. This was a house, and someone might be trapped inside. He knelt down and examined the debris more closely. He saw a section of wall with a window frame still partially intact. He saw a piece of furniture, a dresser perhaps, sticking out from the rubble. And then he saw it. A small, faded piece of paper attached to Rusty's collar. He carefully reached out and took the note, his hands trembling slightly. He unfolded it and read the words written in shaky handwriting. "Help. Trapped in basement. 12 Elm Street. Eleanor Ainsworth." Jake felt a surge of adrenaline. This was it. This was what the cat had been trying to tell him. He looked at Rusty with a newfound respect. "Good boy," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "You're a hero, you know that?" He turned and shouted to his crew, who were still working on clearing the main road. "Over here. We've got a live one. I need some help." The other rescuers rushed over, their faces lighting up with hope. They had been searching for survivors all day, but so far, they had found only bodies. The thought of finding someone alive gave them renewed energy. They quickly assessed the situation and began working to clear a path to the basement. They used shovels, crowbars, and their bare hands to move the debris, working carefully but quickly. The pile of wreckage was unstable, and they had to be careful not to cause a further collapse. Jake stayed near the spot where Rusty was sitting, talking to the cat, reassuring him, praising him. He also called out to Eleanor, letting her know that they were there, that they were coming to get her. "Eleanor," Can you hear me? We're here. We're going to get you out." He heard a faint reply, a weak cry for help. It was coming from beneath the rubble from the basement. "We hear you, Eleanor. Just hang on. We're almost there." The rescuers worked feverishly, their movements precise and coordinated. They removed large pieces of wood, twisted metal, and broken furniture, creating a narrow tunnel through the debris. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, they reached the basement. They cleared away the remaining rubble, revealing a small, dark opening. Jake shone his flashlight into the opening, his heart pounding in his chest. He saw her then, a frail, elderly woman, lying on her side in the muddy water, her face pale and drawn. She was covered in dirt and debris, and her leg was clearly injured. But she was alive. "Eleanor," Jake called out. "We're here. We've got you." Eleanor opened her eyes, her gaze weak and unfocused. She saw the light, the faces of the rescuers, and a wave of relief washed over her. "Rusty?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. Jake looked down and saw Rusty, who had followed them into the opening. The cat was rubbing against Eleanor's leg, purring loudly. "He's here, Eleanor," Jake said, his voice choked with emotion. "He's the one who found you. He's a hero." The rescuers carefully lifted Eleanor out of the basement, placing her on a stretcher. She was shivering uncontrollably, and her skin was cold and clammy. They wrapped her in blankets and started administering first aid. Eleanor clutched Rusty to her chest, her fingers tangled in his fur. "You saved me, boy," she whispered. "You saved my life." As they carried Eleanor away from the wreckage, she looked back at the remains of her home. It was gone, reduced to nothing but rubble. But she was alive, and she had Rusty. That was all that mattered. The rescuers took Eleanor to a makeshift medical center that had been set up in the town's community center. She was treated for her injuries, given warm fluids, and monitored for hypothermia. She was weak and exhausted, but she was stable. Rusty stayed by her side the entire time, curled up on her bed, purring contentedly. He wouldn't leave her, not even for a moment. When Sarah, Eleanor's daughter, arrived from California the next day, she rushed to her mother's side, her eyes filled with tears. She hugged Eleanor tightly, overwhelmed with relief and gratitude. "Mom, I was so worried," she said, her voice choked with emotion. "When I heard about the tornado, I thought." "I'm all right, dear," Eleanor said, her voice weak but steady. "I'm all right. Thanks to Rusty." Sarah looked down at the ginger cat, who was now nestled in Eleanor's arms. "He's a hero, Mom," she said. "A real hero." The town of Havenwood was devastated by the tornado. Many homes were destroyed, businesses were ruined, and lives were lost. But the community rallied together, supporting each other, helping each other rebuild. Eleanor's house was gone, but she didn't care. She had survived. She had Rusty, and she had the support of her daughter and the entire community. She eventually moved into a small apartment in a nearby town, closer to Sarah and her family. Rusty, of course, went with her. He adapted to his new surroundings quickly, finding new sunbeams to nap in, new places to explore. Eleanor never forgot the kindness of the rescuers, especially Captain Jake Thompson. She wrote him a letter, thanking him for saving her life, for belying in Rusty. She also sent a donation to the local fire department in honor of Rusty's bravery. The story of Eleanor and Rusty became a local legend, a testament to the enduring power of the human-animal bond, a symbol of hope and resilience in the face of tragedy. It was a reminder that even in the darkest of times, even in the most desperate of situations, miracles can happen. And sometimes those miracles come in the form of a small ginger cat.